Welcome, everyone, to another Cloud Security Alliance webinar. My background as an intelligence analyst means I'm normally talking about bad guy things. What is offense doing? I wanted to make this one a little bit different and talk to you all about trying to take a best guess looking into the future, a year, 2 years, 5 years. What does it look like when this becomes normal? Because I think we're at the point where it's sort of like when the internet became widely commercialized. There were people at work or at school who had access and who knew how to use it, and there were people who didn't. And now it seems very normal. Everyone does it, right? So the time periods we'll look at, short, medium, and long term, are going to be the near future, the point at which adoption is more widespread and there's some winners and some losers in the workplace from that, and maybe the distant future when it's widespread and it's just the way work is done. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know that all this will happen, but these are really just as a framework for discussing some of the evidence that we do have so far about how AI is actually used for defenders and for those who are on offense. So this is really just an excuse to talk to you about the good evidence that we have, but I want to talk about it in terms of short, medium, and long-term predictions. Long term is how we're going to start. We're going to work backwards to being closer to today. And the reason I'm doing that is when I say long term here, we're talking 2 to 5 years. AI is moving very fast, so even that may be very aggressive. But for any kind of analytic prediction, you get more than 5 years out, and you're probably just guessing. But in the 2 to 5 year range, we are really talking about fundamental issues, right? What really is this technology at its essence good for? So looking out in that time frame, if you're on offense worldwide, a world in which AI, LLMs are widely available is one in which there's, a lower cost to conduct attacks. One skilled professional can run agents of many assistants who are helping him or her and discovering vulnerabilities as well. But that also means when you think about an APT group or a nation state or a big criminal group, and as an institution, they are funding, putting resources into conducting attacks, there's going to be a certain level of sophistication that today only the really big players can play because it takes a certain scale to do the research necessary to find some of these more obscure 0 days or to, conduct critical infrastructure attacks that really bring things down for a long time. Even if you have the underlying technical elements in your team, there's a certain scale you have to have to the research and operations because intellectual work, in this case hacking, is something that at least at some level can be done by a machine and you can spend marginally to increase how much of it you get. I think we're going to see what are currently today mid-tier and lower-tier actors playing in those more advanced offensive realms. For reasons that we'll talk about shortly as defense gets better, and I do think this is a big net positive for defense, just to be clear. I think the future where AI is mature and widely implemented is going to be much more secure percentage-wise than it is today. That also means that if remote network operations aren't going to work, almost by definition, you're going to have to rely more on insider threats, supply chain operations, those kind of blended operations. It's going to be harder and harder to beat, the technical analysis, the outer network perimeter, the security equipment that's there, even just moving to the cloud today, much more secure than being on premises. So, but broadly speaking, you should see defense greatly improve, purely technical defense. Even with the lower barriers to entry, I'm expecting more actors playing, but those actors might look a lot like today's North Korea, where they're replacing their own employees into your organization, trying to do sort of an insider-enabled attack. Already happens today, but will be almost by necessity more common in the future. If you're on defense, not just in the cyber intelligence realm, but broadly, if you're doing cybersecurity, being able to operate at speed and scale is going to be an enormous advantage. A lot of what happens is you don't patch in time, or you don't have visibility on what needs to be patched. If you can contain those kinds of small initial beachhead operations within roughly an hour or less, statistically speaking, if you look at studies, the difference between stopping an attack altogether and containing an attack within roughly an hour or less, really in terms of the damage to an enterprise is almost nothing. It's almost the same to contain quickly as it is to prevent. It's going to be much more doable in the future to automate containment and also automate patching. So huge advantages to defenses, especially if you're talking about large enterprises and government networks. Once we get past the, perhaps rough phase where we're moving into this realm, once it's mature, that's going to be a huge advantage for defense. That idea of, attackers only have to be right once and defenders have to be right every time. An AI-driven defense is largely repeatable and it's sleepless. So not perfect, but it's going to be have much less margin where attackers can get in. You could still end up in a situation where society as a whole has some systemic fragility as AI becomes and permeates more devices and becomes more an integrated part of our lives. Means that even if the percentage of attempts of attacks goes way down, there's going to be more to attack. You could say more surface area. Your surface area will increasingly be everyday life. So I will say I'm not confident in that at all. I think it's going to be a big net positive for defenders. Even the tiny percentage of time that attacks get through, it could have a bigger societal impact than it does today. What does it mean, if you're in the HR department or if you as a cybersecurity leader are thinking about your team, what team do you need 2 to 5 years from now? A lot of what makes AI special is that up to a certain level of intelligence, it is able to automate the implementation of intellectual work. This is not unprecedented. I mean, there was a point at which, if you wanted to go to space, you had to have human calculators. Well, eventually that was replaced by electronic calculators, and you still needed engineers to design, spacecraft and policy people to decide whether you were going to go to space or not. This is a more extreme version of that. A lot of what we think of, not just in terms of arithmetic and mathematical calculation, but writing, research, these kind of more qualitative types of work that we think of as being uniquely human. Judgment, what questions should I research? The social skills, how do I work with other people on a team? Those will become more valuable because as you're able to do more routine intellectual work and automate it with AI, you're going to generate a tremendous amount of value and be able to make a lot of predictions about everyday life that currently require human experts. And in the future, the humans will be the ones making the judgment of what to do about it or what to investigate or how to allocate resources. But that other part, that day to day, getting in and doing the work, is going to be different. So the skill set that you're recruiting for in the future, yes, you will have to have a certain amount of implementation skill just to know what the AI tools are capable of. But as you're putting together a cybersecurity team or a threat intel team in particular, you're going to be recruiting and retaining for judgment, which will be more important than ever. The key dilemma, which I don't have a good answer for, that's great to say that in the future your senior analysts will be 10 times as valuable as they are today, and your senior leaders will be creating 20 times as much value for your enterprise or for your citizens as they do today. That's great. How do you create the senior analysts and leaders of tomorrow if these sort of entry level routine work you not only don't need people for, but AI may be better at? How do you recruit and retain people to get to that point long term? Analysis isn't a standalone profession. It may be a skill set, right? A very valuable one, but cyber threat intel analysis or cybersecurity analysis might be one skill set that is part of a larger package, right? Just like mathematical literacy for most people is part of their overall skill set, not the standalone thing that they're doing with their job. Even if their job is quantitative and very math focused, it's one of several skill sets that they have. That's probably how cybersecurity work looks as well. So let's give some examples from today of why I think these might be reasonable trends. The first one is that if you look at this is for offense, if you look at cyber threat groups, there are a lot of cyber threat groups that have already invested heavily in technical skill, but maybe they lack the language resources or there's a high opportunity cost for their language resources. And so they aren't actually a threat, maybe globally, but they could still be a regional powerhouse. There are several criminal groups like this in Latin America. There are some extremely skilled government groups in sub-Saharan Africa, but the quintessential example is Iranian groups, which in the Middle East are, regional cyber hegemons, very threatening, high success rates stealing sensitive information, high success rates going after even critical infrastructure sometimes. And yet they do less in Europe and even less in the US and very little in East Asia. And that's largely because of the language barrier. Well, that's not a factor for them anymore. If you're thinking about it from a resource perspective, they really are looking for more language skill. You've either got to grow that by raising one of your country's top students and giving, making them become a linguist essentially, and then assigning them this job. But you can't do that quickly. Today with LLMs, you can start writing very convincing spear phishing messages on short order. You can say, I want that, put some money into it, and you can buy it very quickly. And in fact, that is what we see cyber criminals do. These are all the various criminal LLMs because the major LLMs from Gemini and Claude and ChatGPT, we all put a lot of effort into red teaming and trying to prevent abuse and jailbreaking of our frontier LLM models. So criminals largely rely on open source models that they've trained to conduct criminal operations. Otherwise, they face reliability problems. They can't reliably use the public models. So what is it that they sell each other? Well, some of them do code generation, some of them, help with malware development, but they almost all do phishing because that is a universal missing reagent and it's something they all need. So this is language translation, but it's also almost like marketing experience. What type of phishing message works for that target? They've trained these LLMs to go against various industries and to do good, deep initial reconnaissance. That often fills a critical gap for a lot of very skilled APT groups. So, for example, this is a criminal group that we follow. These are real prompts that they're putting in. They're essentially asking for technical help, but what they're really doing is trying to make sure that their malware still works, right? They're looking for bug fixing. Now, why would they do that? Well, because it's a high opportunity cost for their technical people. They want their technical people hacking and conducting on keyboard operations and leading the operation. They don't want them fixing the software, fixing the code, especially when to hire someone you're exposing yourself to the risk of a law enforcement penetration. All organizations have a hard time getting enough technical personnel, but if you're a criminal group, it's really risky to acquire new technical personnel if you think about it that way. So they've got a high opportunity cost for those technical folks. They want them hacking, not maintaining software. The degree to which they can use an LLM to do that, extends the essentially payout of their organization. Criminal groups also use AI to sell AI. They don't want to handle tech support themselves any more than a lot of companies do. They have bots that, if you buy their GPT, in this case it's malware GPT, if you buy access to that, obviously criminals wouldn't buy it if they had technical problems and it didn't work. So they want good reputations. Reputations matter in criminal groups just as much as they do in legitimate business, and they handle a lot of that with automated AI bots. Now let's look medium term. This is not necessarily this year. Maybe it's next year or a little beyond. It's kind of in that time frame. I typically say this is 1 to 2 years out. What does the environment look like? How is everyone using AI at that point? In the medium term, and we can see this being developed already, like I will give you some good examples of this already starting to happen, but this will be widespread within 2 years, a broader array of actors finding 0 days than today. Again, it goes back to that fundamental idea that the barriers to entry go down, and also literally there are good tools for finding bugs. Okay, so you're going to have more actors finding 0 days. What that means for you as a defender is you can't just track the usual suspects. You've got to track maybe a wider array of actors than you have in the past. Because of the language translation that I talked about, you might be threatened by actors operating from different regions. And now, even at a technical level, you're going to do more probably zone defense, trying to figure out what technology needs to be defended versus tracking just a few specific threat groups, even on the high end for 0 days. The groups that are conducting attacks are increasingly going to go for open weight models. I think, again, because of the protections that the Western frontier labs have, and also because those are closed systems and the need to manipulate these systems to enable them to do offensive or criminal things. That's not 100%. APT groups do use Claude, and they try to use Gemini and GPT. I'm not saying that they don't, but overwhelmingly, generally, China developed open weight models because they can manipulate them to their own ends. They're also, those open weight models are going to be most popular in the parts of the world that maybe don't have access to the frontier models. So as the southern hemisphere essentially develops and becomes more involved in cyber offense, it's just going to be natural for them. If you're going to university there, those might be the models that you grow up using. You might just also be more familiar with using them. On defense, I think this is a really interesting one that our own Project Zero has pointed out, but so have multiple other leading academics and studies. AI is getting really good at finding vulnerabilities and preventing 0 days from essentially textual errors. I'm not a vulnerability researcher, so I tend to think about it as, memory allocation is a good example, but this is something that's wrong in the implementation in the text, and the text unto itself can be analyzed and show you that, oh, that's not how you implement that, or it's an unsafe way of implementing this or that thing. LLMs are really good at finding those type of problems. The kind of bugs that you see where it's not that there's anything wrong with the line by line implementation, it's that if you were to map it all out, the state that the software can get in might lead to, a logic error. Or, for example, you get this a lot with authentication. The individual authentication calls are all correct, but the situation under which you're calling the authentication might have a gap that can be exploited. AI actually has pretty low success rates finding those so far. So not only are you going to have more actors finding 0 days, but you're also going to have different 0 days being found, because a lot of the straightforward textual ones, the memory allocation errors, for example, hopefully the defenders are finding those first and patching them. So what are the people on offense finding? Maybe logic or stateful errors. Harder to find. AI not as good at finding them, but again, if you're on offense, even if you've got a lot of people looking, you might still find them. So that's where the offense only having to be right once and defense having to be right every time might still be an issue. On the other hand, I think we're at the point now and in the near future where certainly big organizations like Google itself already, but I think you'll see a lot of other enterprises being fast followers, quickly patching when there's a new 0 day, a new vulnerability, a new version of software that maybe they haven't explained why. Being able to quickly patch your entire network. Obviously, if you're in the cloud, a lot of that's essentially logical software based anyway. You're not having to go out and find physical devices to patch. Most exciting for me is the ability to automate the response to intrusion attempts, to come up with a playbook for how you want to handle things and quickly automate it. I think, again, we're doing some of that at Google already, and that'll permeate pretty quickly. In the HR side of things, you're going to have a lot of senior analysts who, sit side by side with each other, and you think of them both as being high skilled, and some are going to be AI adopters and willing to learn, and some are not. You might see a big divergence over the next 2 years where one starts to 5x or 10x their output and the other struggles. And so that's going to be a really difficult inside the office kind of management issue. How do you take senior people, some of whom continue to grow with this new technology and some don't? At Google, what this looks like, I mean, we trained one of our AI systems to look for 0 days in a particular piece of software, OpenSSL. We kind of had a sense because we had human intelligence that there was a criminal group planning to exploit a 0 day. So we knew the answer already that there was a 0 day. And we were able to put this system 24/7 to work finding it. And it did find it before the attack was conducted. That's a first to stop a 0 day like that. But I don't think it'll be the last. On the more defensive side, Google has used machine learning tools essentially to check our own software for bugs. We now use Gemini to fix 15% of those bugs. Again, those tend to be lower skilled kind of bugs, but essentially just by using that LLM, you're getting 15% more time back for for your human experts to hopefully work higher difficulty bugs. And on the defensive side, again, the ability to take an indicator that you see that you've detected on your network and to understand quickly the context, not only what's happening at your organization, but what's happening at other organizations in your industry or in your physical geographical region, and to automate a playbook to say, when this part of the network, if it's compromised by an APT group or by a high skilled criminal group, let's not assume that it's commodity, just crimeware, even if the actual indicator is perhaps commodity malware. Let's not assume that it's nothing. If it's a particular part of our organization that is sensitive or operational, maybe you go ahead and quarantine that automatically. You can change people's access in the blink of an eye. So thinking through what kind of risks you're willing to take, what do you want to automate versus what do you want a human to have to approve? If it's 2:30 a.m. and nobody's at work except for the overnight SOC team, and it's a big strategic kind of decision that might affect operations, what confidence level do you have to have in order to take certain automated actions? Those are going to be particular to each organization and each industry, but those are the kinds of things you should be thinking through because the gains from automating that first line of defense are tremendous. It's probably the biggest near-term security gain is the ability to match a small problem that you detect on your network, and you're not just reporting on it and writing up a report and sending it up the line and waiting for a decision, but you're going to go ahead and immediately take some remediative action. I think that's tremendous defensive gain. Finally, talking about the short term, when there are 0 days in the next year or two, in the past you get lots of victims, like with Hafnium, the exchange vulnerability, you get lots of victims, but very few are exploited. AI is going to make it easier to exploit all of that. If you're on defense, we're entering a world where AI is already drafting better first drafts than cyber intel analysts are. And again, if you're in HR, you're looking for people who can work more independently now. AI is going to make it possible to quickly draft instead of taking a couple of days to do a first draft of a paper or a decision paper. With direction, the AI can do it in 30 seconds. So quicker decisions and much larger output. Certainly at Google, we are expecting the same analysts to produce multiples of reports that they did even just a few years ago. And with LLMs perhaps as the base layer of coordinated decision making, not papers and emails going around, but you're all working with a corporate chatbot. Looking at our own DeepMind, which is our AI research institute, these guys have won 3 Nobel Prizes in the past 2 years, so I think they're pretty good at what they do. The darker squares are more automated. They were able to automate SQL injection attacks, other kinds of operations. I think we're going to see bad guys being able to do that. The things that are automated well are the parts of the operation that are clearly defined. Here's a SQL injection. The things that are harder to automate are things like exfiltration. Steal that document and don't get caught requires a lot of human judgment, which you'll recall from earlier, something you should be recruiting for. Don't take my word for it. APT42, an Iranian group, they've had a lot of success powering up their offensive operations by automating the reconnaissance phase. Go out, look at these targets, give me a map of who they are as a business or a government target, help me find potential victims, do all the language translation and prepare a spearfish. Multiples of the early stages of their operation. Again, over the next year or two, we're not looking for AI to replace anybody, but what you'll need as a CTI analyst certainly is the ability to drive teams of agents that work for you. At Google, that means doing maybe, unless it's really complicated, I'd say the large majority of malware analysis, we can automate. Instead of taking days, we can get a report 27 seconds. You're writing up, this is what I do historically, you're writing up a physical report for your boss to make a decision. Instead of taking days to write that, you might take 30 minutes. And for our own incident response team, they were able to improve the amount of time they spent working incidents 51%. All they did, almost all the gain, was from having Gemini write the first draft of their incident response. And finally, when we look at providing security for open source, we don't just scan Google software, we do some of the leading open source packages. We've been able to use LLMs to give our fuzzing tools better guidance on what sort of prompts they should attempt to fuzz off of. 30% increase in the number of packages that we've been able to cover. So lots to be optimistic about. Again, I have a lot of confidence this will be a net positive for defense, both in the short term, but especially in the long term. But certainly bumps in the road where you need to be thinking through what kind of team you want to hire, hiring for judgment, communication skill, and setting high expectations. Analysts have to use these tools in their job to keep up, and they should be get multiples of their past performance. So a little different than the normal presentation I do. I hope you all found it interesting. Thank you.